Hey everybody, welcome to the Marquez Says Show. I'm your host, Marquez Mosher, and this is my co-host, cohort, and eldest son, Austin Mosher. He and I always seem to bring out the feisty side of each other, and it leads to some very spirited conversations. There's never really any one topic. We see the world from many different perspectives, and sometimes we agree, and sometimes we don't. Either way, it gets very interesting, so sit back, relax, and have a bit of fun at our expense as we explore some of the most unexpected perspectives you'll ever hear about the world we live in. So, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Marquez Says Show. I'm Marquez. Smart mouth over there is
Austin.
Glad he admits to it. How y'all doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, thanks.
Good.
Oh, you were asking our audience.
Yeah, but given that this is recorded, I'm glad you answered.
Our live studio audience.
So, today, kind of taking a different approach with everything that's been going on, with all of the, just from the beginning of this year, half the world burning, plagues, viruses, civil unrest. What else am I missing? I know there's probably something else. Aliens.
Killer bees.
Oh, yes, killer hornets. Yes, that's right. Murder hornets.
Murder hornets.
Yep. So I just thought, I'm curious about history, how history is going to look at all this. I mean, you mentioned when we were just talking about pre-production, is
this a joke to you?
We were talking about how you were talking about some of this stuff in 2013, about how these things are repeating. I mean, and it's unfortunate, but yeah, it is repeating, and I thought we were supposed to learn from history. Otherwise, we're destined to repeat it. So,
Was that how the saying goes?
I think so. I think I got it pretty close to that one. But it just, I mean, you talk about whether or not it looks like the 20s. People said they wanted it like the 20s. And the 20s started coming in for our 2020 is, here's a virus, can't drink alcohol, can't go to pubs, you know what I mean? Or can't go to the pubs because the bars are shut down. It's like, yeah, that was pretty close.
On the flip, liquor stores became essential.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So look, if there's one thing that we're doing better than the 1920s.
I would not admit to that being better. So, but that's a whole nother issue altogether. But I mean, ever since, with as far as the civil rights part of this, I was looking it up last night, and ever since we started, when the foundations back in Jamestown, it was literally the late 1600s, right around, the late 1600s was when tobacco started to pick up. And that was when they started to realize it can be an economic force and that it could actually be a driver and sustainable and stuff. And then about 60 years later, around, I think it was the 1730s, 40s, something like that, there had been some rebellions, slave rebellions, and some issues of that sort. Yeah. And the realization that maybe this isn't the best idea. And then it was right around 1800s, after the Revolutionary War, and it was, I think, the peak right at the beginning of the 1800s of the slavery, or the tobacco trade, slavery, and so on and so forth. And so then again, the conversation came up, which, of course, as we know, led to, about 60 years later, Civil War. And then about 60 years after that, we had Jim Crow and all that stuff in the early 1900s.
Yep.
And then it was a little bit sooner. It was only about 40, 50 years. And then we had civil rights in the 1960s. And then here we are again, 60 years later, dealing with this all over again. It just seems like every other generation we've been dealing with something like this. And I don't know how history is going to look at it, from if we don't do anything different this time around.
Yeah, well, I mean, like what you were talking about, how history is going to look at 2020. Well, the kids are going to have fat textbook on 2020, that's for sure. Like, I'm glad that I already went through my history classes, but yeah, it's insane, the amount of things, just the sheer volume of events that have happened, and we're only in what month are we in? I don't even remember what month we're in right now.
We're like literally 6 months in. We still have, like any other normal time, we'd say like, hey, we still have half a year left. What are you going to do with it? And people are already kind of like, oh, is the year over? It's not. And this doesn't even touch on the political landscape, because that was another part of it, was that we have a law and order president, like we did 60 years ago when Nixon said, hey, and then the 60s and the not only just the civil unrest, but just the general unrest and the culture changes. And we've had that in the last decade leading up to the 2020. I just, it's.
Well, you mentioned something earlier before we started recording that I thought was really interesting. Is it seems like it's every other major generation. So it's like it's skipping. Like one generation doesn't seem to really be investing all that much stock into fixing this sort of stuff or really shifting the paradigm very much. But then all of a sudden the generation after that comes in and it's like, oh, okay, no, we're going to do this. We're going to really... I mean, you got young people going out right now doing the protests, kicking, smoke grenades, or tear gas canisters back at the police and the National Guard, and it's wild. It's crazy.
And I just didn't even think about this one. About one thing I hope doesn't come back is the war element. Those other ones obviously always had a war, and not that we're not at war, because we do have troops deployed and they're in danger, but we didn't have that aspect of it. But we had protesters, peaceful protesters getting bullied out of the way by law enforcement and military for a photo op for the president. And we also had in 1970 the student at Kent State get shot.
Yeah,
doing those for no reason other than they were protesting and so on and so forth. So it's scary, because I wonder about if we're sit here 30 years from now, or hopefully not, that we will be talking about the same thing, or 60 years from now. Are they going to have the same conversations? Are they going to be going through the same thing? I hope your kids aren't. I mean, I hope it's better.
Yeah, I hope so too. We've talked about this. Everybody right now is really pushing for things to change. And, I'm not going to let up. I hope people don't let up. But it's like what you said, it's scary. It's hard not to think that things won't change, because we've all been here before. And then it's just it's a startling revelation to think like, 60 years. It's almost like, I know that some of these problems are all connected to racism, but a lot of them are. And it's like racism is like Pennywise the clown. Like it pops up, like it cycles every 60 years. Pennywise was what, 27 years or whatever?
I don't remember, but yes, I know what you're saying.
Right. It's like, it's cyclical.
It is.
And it's insidious. And it's almost like that's what the whole nation's like. If the nation is dairy, then that's what.
And I think a lot of that comes back to, maybe as a nation, you quote unquote, the hardest thing to do, I always say this, is admit when you're wrong. And we've admitted that we know that slavery was wrong, racism is wrong. We know that, but there's so many people that are still unwilling to acknowledge it, and there's still even some people that still don't think it's wrong. And I think that may be part of it, because we've gone back. We were founded on the backs of the slaves. I mean, I was talking to April, and I mentioned that it almost at every major turn where we had a choice between two things, America kind of got it wrong. We chose alcohol over hemp. We chose tobacco over hemp.
Right.
Now we know that hemp probably could have been just as marketable and has just as many uses, if not actually more uses.
Definitely more.
All across the board. And yet we chose tobacco instead of hemp. We chose alcohol instead of marijuana,
right?
Which kind of goes in with the hemp thing, of course.
Yeah.
But let's not forget, in the early 1900s and such, and late 1800s, opium dens. Cocaine was considered normal and stuff. I mean, some scientific, obviously, knowledge, but when we could have we were choosing mass transit. When the Industrial Revolution came around in New York and LA and stuff, but yet we got rid of that in favor of the car. Now, I love cars and the individuality and what it allows, but now we fast forward 100 years and go, crap, that probably wasn't maybe the best choice, or at least we should have realized what was coming, because now there was the reliance on fossil fuels as opposed to renewable energies. I mean,
well, and then a lot of this comes down to money. These decisions were greed-based decisions, and a lot of it had nothing to do with good intentions. I genuinely believe that. I think that at some point we kind of got to realize that a lot of these people that were making decisions that we want to think were doing it for the right reasons probably weren't.
Oh, no.
And most of them were incredibly just incentivized.
Well, think of Standard Oil and all of that.
Yeah.
Now, I know Rockefeller, I can't remember which magnate, one of them, I don't think it was Rockefeller. It was the other one. I'm blanking on his name.
Morgan? J.P. Morgan.
He was one that actually had altruistic values. I know a little bit. He was one. He wasn't as much. I'm totally blanking on the other guy, but they did. He, you know, one of three of the major, you know, billionaires of the time did, and the other two didn't. You know, transportation, like when the trains, they didn't see themselves as a transportation. They saw themselves as just trains and freight and stuff, and they missed the boat on becoming the next communication. I mean, it just seems that so many decisions were missed, and some of it's hindsight, but there was people then going, hey, maybe we should be considering this. And when you tie that with history and how now we're dealing with the fact that some of the issues have never been resolved, and only now are we having meaningful conversations about them. But I worry about the historical impact of how are we really learning anything?
Yeah. And speaking of the bringing up of the conversations and all that stuff, I want to revise something I said earlier. Racism doesn't pop up every 60 years. The big civil unrest that we exhibit, that's what's popping up, you know, every 60 years. But to kind of touch on it though, why, which I feel like is an interesting question, is why is it specifically the 60 years besides the generation? Why is it? Because it's something that's so horrible, right? Why does it?
I don't know. And
why is it so spread out?
This is just the amateur historian. You know, I'm not. I like history. I like studying it. It's just, but I barely would even say I'm an amateur historian. But just looking back at some of the major events that came through, that 60-year interval, I'm pretty comfortable that you could argue that And I think a lot of it has to do with is the unwillingness of the one generation, the almost the children. Like when it flares up in the 60s, and then their children turned out to be basically the 80s and 90s and stuff, and they didn't really want to deal with it much. But then, of course, the grandchildren went, what the hell are you doing? You know, we got to deal with this.
Yeah.
I think some of that is the case where the initial generation didn't want to address it because the country had just gone through something. And so they were like, hey, you know what? We're better. I think there was a false sense of security.
Yeah.
A false sense of security of that. Look, we're moving forward. We're moving forward.
Do you think it was sort of a complacency as well? Or do you think that it was kind of coming from a genuine place of, no, we're doing good now?
Oh, I think it was more of a complacency or an obliviousness. Maybe even a wanton obliviousness, because the issues were still there. And we you know, yes, things got better, but when you're talking about incrementally better in a situation like this, with a topic like this, that's not good enough.
That's true.
Which is that's a bigger thing now that we talk about.
100%. I totally agree. And this is something that we've talked about before. I've talked about it with a lot of other people. Is just because things are better does not mean it's good enough. I've had that conversation all the time because a lot of people go, well, it's better. Like about anything, right? You shouldn't just settle for better. Like what we've talked about in a previous episode is like try to be perfect. And it really...
Keep striving. And as a person, you should never, like, I mean... I don't get it. To me, maybe it's because I was raised by you, but like that, I've never thought that was good enough. It's like, I'm doing better, right? Yeah. It's great to have that progress, but continuous evolution is kind of where you need to be striving for. I mean, we can all do better, and sometimes, you know, when you say good enough, okay, maybe for that situation in that particular
that carries a negative connotation to me,
right?
That phrase, like good enough,
but. You know, to flip side of the coin, sometimes good enough is, and for certain situations. But
I know if I'm working on a project and somebody says, "Oh yeah, that's good enough," I'm gonna be like, "Oh man, it sucks."
Yeah,
like that's gonna be my immediate default. Is damn, I didn't do it well.
But at the time, like in this particular case, like if someone said that and you knew that you needed to move on to something else, and they were happy, like quote unquote, that client or was happy with the good enough.
Yeah.
That's when it technically is good enough. It's kind of like, you know what, I have to balance this. I have to move on and go, okay, if they're happy, then their expectations were met or exceeded even, and they're good enough. But see, that's a hard thing though, because unless you already have it built into you about striving for more and moving forward, then good enough becomes a crutch. It becomes an excuse for, all I need to do is get to that point. And I think historically, that's a lot of what the United States has done, where each time we kind of, I think when I sum up the history of the United States, the West, building out the West, taming the West, the Wild West, that is what I feel is our personality, that part of it. And there's pros and cons to it. But a lot of the pros, I think, outweigh the cons, because when you were out west originally, if you were a ranch hand and you can handle cattle and so on and so forth, it didn't matter what color you were. But again, you didn't see that in the history books. I was kind of lucky that I had some teachers that kind of showed about you basically, you had the Mexican cowboys, you had black cowboys, they were all mixed in together as long as you could work. And then the East Coast came over and kind of did away with that. That was, and had, again,
honest, I'm not so informed on that, so I don't necessarily.
Well, there's examples of, like, when you talk about the Spanish influence, and we talk about, and it is where it's documented where in the beginning days that it didn't matter. They said that it did not matter what color your skin was if you could get the job done. But as more and more of the influence from Eastern came over, then all of a sudden it was kind of like that guy with money who bought that ranch didn't want to have a black ranch hand because of the prejudice that they had.
I'll have to read into that more and see. I believe you.
It's another one of those things where choices. It was another one of those where the U.S. could have had a choice of, why do we stick to this? Why do we hold on to this? And why do we, but they don't teach that. Like you said, like what you just said, you had a pretty good education, and yet it wasn't really put out there that, it wasn't, I mean, there was always the racism and such, but you also had east of the Mississippi, north and south.
Right.
But when the West, that's why St. Louis is the gateway to the West, as it goes to the West, in those early days, it didn't matter. That was because they didn't necessarily.
It was a lot more do or die.
Absolutely.
Too, when you were doing, it was like, so I could see that being true.
It wasn't that, and don't get me wrong, it's not that it wasn't there. I'm not saying that, but it was a lot less. And had we taken that spirit, had we actually taken that and said that it's your merits and everybody's going to get an even chance and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where would we be now? It would be a totally different situation.
100%. I think what you were saying about how America's always settled for good enough, I don't even know if that I would even, at this point, I don't even know if I would say that's true. I think that they've convinced us, like people in higher positions, that they thought what they were doing was good enough, but they knew better, or they really were against the changes and the progress that they made, but they only did it to appease,
and some of that ties into the system.
So I think it's disingenuous. Yeah,
and I think some of that ties into the systematic racism and if you want to say that there's no systematic racism and you have a legitimate reason for saying it, I think everything I've heard when people say that, the ones who actually want change, the ones that say, hey, we all need to be in this, we're all in this together, humanity and stuff, and they say the systematic part of it, they have a point from their perspective, because they're talking about that we need to basically jump over that, we need to actually be bigger than that, but ignoring that there is a systematic, it's because it's so inherent.
Systemic.
I'm sorry, what am I saying?
Yeah, systematic. Systemic. Yeah, no, it's all good. I wasn't going to. I figured it.
No. That was good because systemic and they're one in the same. I mean, they're somewhat the same. I just don't know if
systematic is an actual word.
Meaning the systemic. I know. I mean, the comment. Sorry, the correlation between the two, systemic and systematic, is literally that it's built into the system.
Yeah, I know. I know what the word means. I'm just saying I don't think systematic is. No,
it's not. It's not the right word. Well, systematic is a real word, but it's not the correct word. It's not. But they both mean almost the same.
Yeah, they mean the same thing.
So that was that was when people say they don't have it. It's true. I mean, you can believe that it's not there, but usually either A, you're someone who says it's not there because it's bigger than that. It's just inherent in all of us, and we need to learn it. Or the ones who say that because they don't believe it and they're wrong. Right. And historically, again, that's part of the problem, is that we never broke that. We never broke that mold.
Yeah. And it's classism has a huge part to play in it too at this point.
The socioeconomic aspect of it.
Right. And I would argue that might even be the bigger problem at this point than anything, because just if you're at that bottom, right, the powers that be, difficult. Right, they're going to do, intentionally or unintentionally, going to do whatever they can to stay at that top. And if that means keeping you down, they're going to do that. And it's just going to be a byproduct of the way that our system has been set up.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right about that. It's the analogy of, wouldn't it be great if we never had to have a rape whistle?
Yeah, right. I know.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because technically, if we didn't, that means that we've eliminated that.
So the rape whistle business.
Yeah.
goes
So
under.
you know, it's but then but that's the case where we're at. That those who are in power want to stay in power, and it's unfortunate because it goes within all the communities. It's not just minority communities; it's majority communities. It's not just the U.S. If a lot of these issues are very acute to the United States, but if you go to other countries and such, corruption or the fact that, you know, based on color of their skin, you know, I read something about like European, where Eastern Europeans coming into Western Europe and how they're treated differently just because they're from Eastern European countries as opposed. It's like that's the same thing. It's the same thing what we're talking about. It's not judging someone, you know, on their character, but on some other attribute. And
yeah.
I historically, you know, there is. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say something.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily the same thing, but it comes down to the same principle.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Because I wouldn't say it's the same thing just because in America the race history is just so different and so much. You know.
And I agree. It's not racism, obviously. But it is basing it the
xenophobia.
prejudice. It's the prejudice. It's the bigotry.
In Europe, anyways.
In Europe, ours is very specific to color of your skin, as we call it, race. And you know, there's there's something that's, it's not necessarily controversial because it's fact, but the President Lincoln had he has stated on the record, historical record, that had he been able to save the Union and kept slavery in place, he would have. He only realized that it couldn't be done, and he took the opportunity, the right thing to do, and then make that one of the reasons. But let's not, you know, from a historical, let's not necessarily gloss over the fact that the Civil War initially wasn't started because of slavery. It was a power struggle between the economies of the North and the South.
Right.
And eventually...
But what drove the economy?
Of course, exactly.
Right.
The secondary reason, like 1B for the South was, of course, we have to keep our slaves in order to keep our economy going. And that's where Lincoln's genius was, in the fact that he recognized so quickly that can't save the Union. It's not going to be saved. We're going to go to Civil War, and realizing that, well, if we're going to do that, we talk about good enough. He realized good enough was not good enough. I need to go all the way through. I need to push this.
Did do that.
This is our opportunity to go. I am going to stand and say, this is what is right. It's not good enough. And he pushed through, free the slaves, et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't even, as evident that he got shot and all of the people and how much, he was so far ahead of his time, there wasn't enough people to support him in order to get us over the hump. And therefore, we went back again. And that's what I hope is not going to happen here as well, where I don't think it will. I think this is a truly different situation where the psyche of the whole United States and even of the world is on display. And I think it's because for the first time that, as many commentators have mentioned, that we all saw a lynching right in front of us. And a lot of the people have never seen anybody die, and it wasn't necessarily in person, but this was a lynching just flat out right in front of us, a killing right in front of us. And if that doesn't move you to go, whoa, that was unnecessary, that could have been avoided, then there's something wrong with you. And that's what I think is different, because so many people could hide. Before plantations or skyscrapers, you know, wherever you lived, go back to the country, go back into the cities and stuff, you could hide from it, and we can't now.
Right. And I think, though, you know, I feel like the hiding thing, again, it's like it was purposeful hiding, right? And there's a big difference, I think, between being ignorant to it and then deliberate hiding. So the people that are deliberately hiding, that's a complete negative. So bad negative. And it's just enabling the problem. That's not a controversial thing to say. Everybody says that. And I think that, you know, that's important. Because, like, what you're saying about the hiding and all that stuff, in school, they teach you not to be a bystander, right? As far as bullying goes and all that stuff. Right. So
you remember in my day, if you were a bully, you were told basically punch the bully in the nose.
Well, that's how I feel about it too.
So it was a little bit of a different.
Well, that's kind of the
approach.
attitude we need to take right now.
Oh, for absolutely.
Yeah, if there's an injustice happening, fight against it. I'm not saying you necessarily you don't have to punch him in the. I mean, but sometimes you should.
Yeah. But definitely speak up. Where I agree, there was so much times where, and again, I think that's where there was a complacency because this correlates along with capitalism in the sense that if life is going good for you, most people don't want to rock the boat. Especially even if it's for the greater good. I mean, there's one of the things in the lessons that I teach, for the classes online, by the way, that you could go to if you want to go to classes.visionperspective.com, is 4C success. And and also another one called the common principle. And it's basically talks about common sense, common ground, common good, and common decency. And if you incorporate those 4 things into your thought process, it'd be amazing how far. And yes, common sense isn't always so common, but it's about getting rid of the nonsense that's around things. And that's what people weren't willing to do. They wanted to just stay calm. I mean, they would even make up excuses. You see things about how, oh, no, they're not. And this goes back before even just necessarily, or not before, but in addition to not just blacks, but also Asians, Irish, and so on. Stay in your lane, stay in your communities. Oh, they like it. It's better this way, et cetera, et cetera. And it was like, no, it's not. And we have to deal with it.
We do. Yeah, I don't even know what more to say on it. Like, it's got to change. We got to keep fighting. Right now is the biggest, arguably, movement that we've had on this in a very, very, very long time. And it's worldwide, too. It's spread, which is huge. And
which is historically, I hope, is going to be... That's how it'll be looked upon, is that historically we will look at it as... That was a change. That was it was as much as 1960s. It was, I don't want it to lead to a civil war. I mean, obviously, but it may be a different type of civil war. It very much may be a digital civil war. Excuse me. And I could see something along those lines where there is change coming as far as legislation, which is what was needed. Things of that sort. But it's, I don't know. Well,
I would argue that it's maybe not even so much legislation, but just a total reconstruction of some of the...
Interesting choice of words.
Right.
Given that the reconstruction period after Civil War. So.
It's true. I didn't even think of that. But there's certain systems and certain things that we have in place that we have to, restructure. Like it's Minneapolis, right? So what Minneapolis is potentially going to do with their police force, this is going to be a test to see if it works. I think it will.
I meant to tell you that there's actually a town that did do it.
I know there's a few.
It's a
smaller towns, but there are. It's not unheard of.
For those who are basically saying, oh, they hear the word defund the police and they think that it means there's no police department. That's ignorant. It's not that. There's not going to be no police department. That's not the structure at all.
Yeah.
And depending on where you're talking about, some of it is. Police departments may be revamped, but any future budget allocations are going to go to communities. And then some are actually considering a whole different structure where it's much more of a community-based police force, but it's still a police force. So
it's still there to protect and serve and keep everybody safe, but what it's trying to do is keep everything more community and local sourced and local based. Because people, they take care of their community. Well, I mean, you try to. A lot of people.
But this time, the community standard, or what the definition, that's the word I was looking for. The definition of community is actually much more encompassing now. Before, when you had that, it was you stay in your community and I'll stay in mine and we're just fine. Now, they're realizing that that's not the case. This is our community, period. We're all going to be helping each other out. We're all going to be doing something.
Well, and then the danger that existed beforehand about, well, this is my community, that's your community, we're going to stay on our things, don't come into my community, came from us not all sharing the same values as a country.
Which is ironic, given that we proclaim to have basically a constitution and a Bill of Rights that essentially lay out...
Right. Well, I think, though, if you were to go into two very different communities, they would say, oh, but we do uphold that. That's how we view it. And they might be right in the way that they justify that and all that stuff. But we need to get to a point where it needs to work on both scales, the micro and the macro. Obviously, that's not like some controversial thing to say. But if everybody shares the same basic common principles of, well, I care about you as a human being, and that's like the basic flat line, no matter what, I care about you as a human being, you can have each little community, you know, kind of support itself, govern itself, do all that stuff. And then if all of them are operating under the same principle and everybody's looking out for each other in those individual communities, it'll spread and it becomes a bigger thing, and then everything works okay.
And I think a lot of people want to get to that point. And I used to be one that wanted to get there as soon as possible. And my mistake was glossing over the fact that we hadn't come as far or had done as much work on the racist problem that we have in the United States. And this time, hopefully, will go a long way towards that, because we will be able to understand a big theme that's coming out of this is that Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean no other lives matter. It's just that those are the ones we need to concentrate on right now. And indeed, that's the case. So let's do that, because once that gets better, once we actually have true change within that, we can move to the next step and move to it. Because historically, I don't want to repeat the same things over and over again. I don't want 60 years from now. And, you know, we didn't even, you're right, dive deep into the socioeconomic parts of things and how that influences it, and then the education and, you know, and all of these other, but I know one way or the other, these conversations and the leaders that are picking up from on the city levels, county levels, state levels are a lot better than what we're seeing on the national level. And
yeah, no, 100%. I'm really glad you said that, because local leaders, and it's something that it was set up to be this way, and everybody talks about it, yet I feel like it's not really happening. The local leaders are so much better than the federal leaders, and it needs to be that way. And then, but what we've seen, I mean, all these people, though, the federal leaders come from the local, and then somewhere along that line, they're, I don't necessarily want to say corrupted, because some of them aren't corrupted.
Yeah, they're not just corrupt, but
dilute their values or what they're trying to do.
And I think a lot of that will...
Well, some are corrupted.
Yeah, and we find that throughout that times, there's always some leader that rises up and kind of takes over the mantle, and then usually gets shot. But
we haven't had a president get shot in since what, the 80s?
Actually get shot? Yeah. Reagan was the last one who actually got shot.
It's been like 40 years.
Yeah. So, but I was just not talking about that. I just meant like that 60-year parcel.
Yeah.
All of the particular leaders, at some point, you know, whichever one actually becomes the biggest threat to the status quo, gets shot, seems like. You know,
that's true. Well, because people, like I said, and what you've said, the powers that, you know, the powers that exist don't really want all that much change. They just want to give the illusion of change, and anybody that's actually providing any change is a threat.
Yep. And I think and the reason for it is that there needs to be enough people get behind it. That's actually how we've moved forward. Whether it's gay rights, whether it's civil rights, whether it's the ethnic rights, whatever you want to call it, whatever those rights are, human rights in general. Yeah. You had to have a majority of the society. And I think in this case, that's kind of the problem, is we've always had just a slight majority. There's always been maybe 51%, and they got that legislation through. Yeah. And then it would tip back the other way, or it was never such a super majority or overwhelming. But I think now you've got NASCAR banning Confederates. You've got military branches of the military banning the Confederate flag. And you have your opinion for the Confederate flag, but first and foremost, they were losers, which is something that one person commented about. You get so you get wrapped up in that aspect of winners and losers. They were the losers, and they were traitors. So think about that from an historical sense, since that's kind of the topic. If you're behind it and you're saying it's because of the Southern pride and all that stuff, it's like, you do realize that they lost, and you do realize that they were traitors. It's not like a sports team where you're loyal to your sports team and next season you're gonna try it again. This was literally people that said, I am breaking away from the United States, and the reason was because they wanted to keep a way of life, and their way of life was slavery. Had it been a different way of life, maybe this conversation would be different. But it's, and Southern pride and all that, there is a lot of other symbols that you can you can go with that you can actually have that and be proud of and use. But that's the one thing we didn't really touch on, was how the Confederate monuments about whether or not they should stay up or stay down. And I'm not totally clear on how I feel about it, because one half of me says I don't like them, and I don't necessarily want them up in certain areas, because a lot of them were actually derived from the 1920s, and the purpose of them was to intimidate the black community.
That's true. Exactly. I was gonna say the same thing.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. I can't really. There's nothing for me to disagree with there. I definitely agree that the Confederate flag is. It's not a hate symbol. I'm not gonna say it's a hate symbol. However, it is definitely something that is designed to. I don't even know if it's necessarily designed to intimidate, but it is something that we need to be very aware of, and I do think we should probably limit.
It's like anything else. There's a positive connotation to things and a negative connotation.
Right, and it's really hard because I'm worried about any time putting like a blanket statement on anything or banning things outright, because like I've said, I think that's a slippery slope whenever we give any authority to be like, hey, no, that's gone. Right. Like I don't feel comfortable with that.
And I see where you're going, because there's a bigger picture, but there's also something to be said that as the United States of America, you would have no problem saying that if we were in like the Vietnamese War, when we were in the Vietnam War, and things of that sort, you wouldn't be necessarily waving that flag.
No, definitely
because
not.
It's kind of like that's actually disrespectful to the United States of America.
It is, and the fact that we've allowed that
from a technical side of things,
totally. Yeah. And the winners decide what's in the history books. So the fact that we still the country allows that to happen, it says either two things, and one of them's either positive and one of them's negative. It says that we're either like, well, you know what, we are not gonna limit your thing. This is a positive. We're gonna let you do whatever you want to do, and we're not gonna be tyrants. Or it's condoning the Confederacy and basically saying, well, it wasn't that bad. When in reality, it was that bad. The South, and it's okay to be from the South and have Southern pride and all that stuff. Absolutely. But to celebrate the things that the Confederacy stood for in particular, that becomes really dicey. Real dicey, real quick.
And I did hear one example of it was that, you know what, your Southern pride, your Southern way of living, and the Southern habits and all of that stuff, depending on which ones you're talking about, is fine. But a lot of it was built on the backs of slavery. Well, so you still can't necessarily...
All of it,
Well, no, I meant some things, maybe food. I was trying to not make a blanket statement. Like, if there's certain traditions that weren't necessarily directly tied to slavery, maybe Black culture, but not necessarily to slavery.
True.
I meant that you still can't necessarily argue that, well, it's because of Southern pride. It's because of, our way of living and all of that, because that was based on slavery. Now, if you can show it where it wasn't that portion of it, okay, then you would have an argument. But that flag was still considered, treason. I mean, that just like in England, just like in England, they're not flying the United States flag, or they weren't, certainly back then. If you had been caught with that, you would have been exiled, killed, whatever.
Totally agree. Do I think that Confederate flags should be flown in public spaces or even in private spaces? No, I personally don't. I think that is a horrible thing to do at this point, and especially knowing and being able to look back and have the historical context and everything, that it should not be allowed. But your question about the monuments in general, I do think we should probably take them down.
Yeah, and as long as it's kind of that's the reason for it, is that it was something that was designed to intimidate and so on, because we cannot, and I can't stress this enough, we cannot stricken this stuff from the history books.
No, exactly. That's the thing I don't want to do.
If they're in museums, if they are in textbooks, if they are in school books and stuff like that, as part of the learning and hopefully learning from the mistakes of the past, we must have that. But if it's if it's something that's out there and it was designed when it was put in whatever year the intent of it was to do this, I also thought that rebranding them in the sense of putting some context, like if there's plaques or anything like that, putting in the fact that so-and-so. And this applies, I know you're going to say, people talk about, well, what about Washington? What about Jefferson? What about
I was gonna say that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was gonna say that is because that's the thing is the like George Washington, all them, they all had slaves too. If we're taking down if we're doing it to one, we got to do it to all. To be honest, that's where I stand on it.
But but you know what?
However, the difference is the intimidation tactics.
Yeah,
like
the reason behind it, because if you have a statue of George Washington and you're talking about how he led us, through the Revolutionary War and so on and so forth, okay. Do you talk about General Lee? You talk about him leading a traitorous, nation that seceded from the United States and the reason they were doing it was because they wanted to preserve slavery. That's different. That is a different reason. The fact that they both owned slaves, yeah, we can't whitewash that with like they did with the White House when it burned down during the after the Civil War. I don't want to say it because I don't think it was Civil War. Anyway, I was trying to make a tie in there, but anyway, it didn't work.
Yeah, moving on.
But that's actually, we have to keep it in the history books, but we have to make sure that we balance it with the understanding that it is part of our history, and that's what we're talking about. We have to confront these things and have conversations about it.
We do, and that's why I was going to say, so for the monuments, specifically bringing it back to that again, because I think that is an interesting point of discussion, is a lot of the argument is, well, there's the twofold, right? You get rid of the monuments, and then you're rewriting history. You're blanking out what happened in the history books, or you're taking away our Southern pride. You're taking away our Southern pride, or whatever. Like, one, a Confederate monument is not Southern pride. There's other things that we could put up that could symbolize Southern pride. That would be
and not to mention that all those people,
non-intimidating.
all those people like General Lee and so on and so forth, and some of those other ones and stuff. Yeah, I was just about to. I had a panic moment of going. That was the actual Confederate one. I'm like, oh yeah, Grant. Grant was the other major one for the North. Anyway, they weren't necessarily bad people with some of the stuff. I mean, when you talk about them as a personal level. Because back then, the context, of course, being a slave owner, that was not inherently considered bad. Now we look back and we know it is, and there was people at the time knew that it wasn't. But if you were basically talking about General Lee's prowess as a military person, sure, but you have to necessarily talk about the fact that he was on the wrong side. He was on the wrong side of history. He was on the wrong side of something. And to overlook that would be, that would be a mistake. But on the flip side, it's also a mistake to say that George Washington, he was pristine, or Thomas Jefferson, or stuff. It's like, no, they weren't pristine either. But ultimately what they stood for and what they placed their principles in the ground for, one was for a greater good that would help society. The other, help almost all society. The other was not. And it was dirty.
No, see, that's the thing, though, is I don't think it was for all society. Like, George Washington was not fighting for all society. He was fighting for wealthy white men.
Well, yes, but what I mean by that is that they were looking at it from the perspective of a, for a lack of a better term, a greater good, as opposed to the South. That was basically, he was fighting for...
The South was also fighting for the greater good of the wealthy white man.
Yes,
when you break it down to their core, they were kind of doing the same thing.
That was only my difference in saying is that how they knew that in the South that it was based on the back of owning another person. In the North, especially as it got further and further along when slavery got abolished, it was on the back of a machine. Or I take that back.
That point,
this could be another conversation because I don't want to get into it since we're heading toward the 10. I shouldn't say machine because there was people operating the machines, and then that was a whole nother discussion about exploiting the poor people, the immigrants, and all that stuff. So
exactly. I think that in today's day and age, looking back, it is becoming harder and harder to see distinctions, honestly, between what the founding forefathers did and what the people in the Confederacy were trying to do. Because at the core, they had the same idea. I don't think that I think that especially now, it is difficult to say that either one of them was necessarily had a greater good in mind. I think the only thing that you can delineate, which is what it actually did, was that you're right. If you put it on paper, black and white, their goals, then yes, you're right. It was there was extreme amount of similarities. The way they were willing to go about it, though, is what distinguished between the two. Is that for the North, they were willing, obviously, to not use slavery. Yeah, they did.
And they were okay with that, even though they were just going to replace it with immigrants or poor people, or they were going to basically find another way to do it with machines and so on and so forth. But it wasn't basically like flat out owning someone because of the color of their skin. And ultimately, when it gets all broken down, that's the difference. That's the difference between the North and the South. When it ultimately, because the South was willing to do quote unquote the same things, but they felt that they should do it by owning people based on the color of their skin because they were less worthy. That's a big. It may be the only difference, but it's a huge difference.
No, I agree. It definitely is a huge difference.
But I think we play it up too much, and I think we
do play it up too much,
right,
and we romanticize too much of the founding fathers and stuff. It's okay to be like, yeah, they created America, and that created a lot of good things, but we cannot overlook how they did it.
And had we had these conversations sooner, because we talk about history, this is what we're talking about. Had we had these conversations sooner, we may not be where we are now. Or at least we may have been at this point, but maybe 100 years ago. You know, that those I
think people did have these conversations,
but not this level.
Maybe, not this many people. Maybe the fact that we've got social media and everybody has a cell phone and we're all very connected.
Yep,
it does help spread. Everything. It's made it bigger.
Yep. So hopefully that gives you guys some things to think about, because it's just, let's just not have history repeat itself in a bad way. Let's have it repeat itself in a good way, where the moving forward, the progress that we can achieve. So, anything else?
No. Let's do better than history. Let's make more progress.
Yeah, I would love to be able to tell my grandkids about how 2020 was such a horrible, horrible upheaval on so many different levels, and it was exactly what we needed. Right.
Let's break new ground. Let's be the new standard for, wow. Yep. This was a huge leap in human accomplishment. Yeah.
Oh, I forgot about the space part. And the same as the 60s and stuff. A space race. Now we have a public space race between the different...
Space Force.
Richard Branson and Elon Musk and all those ones. I forgot that. Just to add that in as a side note about how similar we are to the 60s, 60 years ago. So.
And I was really surprised to see that they made Steve Carell the head of the Space Force.
Yeah. Okay, so in the meantime, think more, care more, live more, and remember, you can change your life. We can change the world one decision at a time. Anything else?
Nope. You said it all.
Talk to you next time, guys. Thanks for listening.